Russia is the second largest exporter of oil and gas in the world, home to $100 billion companies such as Gazprom and Lukoil.
Gazprom's announcement that it is unilaterally stopping gas deliveries is another provocation from the Kremlin.
But many of these are owned by powerful oligarchs with massive influence inside and outside of Russia. So how has Putin kept this all under control? Unlawful seizures, arrests, and alleged murder are just a few ways of asserting dominance and ensuring loyalty.
There have been more than 20 mysterious deaths involving Russian businessmen since the war in Ukraine.
But over time, new major players have also emerged. Some fresh faces, whilst others lifelong acquaintances of Putin. These are the people that own Russia. Gazprom is the largest company in Russia by market capitalization and is responsible for over 12% of the global natural gas output. It is vertically integrated, meaning it controls everything in its supply chain, from exploration of gas fields to refining and distribution. Its net assets amounting to over $320 billion, similar to American giant ExxonMobil or British Shell. It became the first Russian state-run corporate enterprise when it was privatized in 1989. The USSR Ministry of Gas Industry became to be known as Gazprom under Viktor Chernomyrdin, who was the minister of the industry at the time. Initially, it became a heavily controlled joint stock company with the state owning 40% of its shares, the rest being distributed to Gazprom employees, members of the public by the voucher privatization scheme, and even foreign investors. Now, 1991 was a turning point for Russia, along with Gazprom. With the Russian Federation being formed and Boris Yeltsin becoming the president of Russia, many things changed.
On July 10, 1991, Boris Yeltsin is inaugurated the first democratically elected president in 1,000 years of Russian history.
Yeltsin nominated Chernomyrdin as the prime minister of Russia, greatly increasing Gazprom's political influence. This came with Gazprom being able to circumvent state regulations, leading to tax evasion, nepotistic appointments, and asset stripping, all aided by the Russian prime minister. This was the starting point of a massive snowball that made Russia what it is today. But like most of its post-communist counterparts, Russia underwent a financial crisis, and in 1998 the government devalued the ruble and completely defaulted on its domestic debt. Yeltsin dismissed Chernomyrdin and reshuffled his entire cabinet
Viktor Stepanovich Chernomyrdin,
before attempting to reinstate him 6 months later. The State Duma refused Yeltsin twice, and Chernomyrdin remained on the chair of Gazprom. Pressure was mounting on Yeltsin. His health was worsening, and he lacked any kind of support from the public and the government, forcing him to nominate the then popular foreign minister Primakov as prime minister, who after a short 8-month term was replaced by a short 5-month term of Sergei Stepashin, before finally nominating Putin. Yeltsin resigned as president of Russia a few months later, paving way for Putin to take the presidency on the 7th of May 2000.
При осуществлении полномочий президента Российской Федерации.
Putin's view on the oligarchy and the overall situation in Russia was different to his predecessors. He wanted to curb the control that the oligarchy had on Russia and was hell-bent on the Russian state controlling important infrastructure and state resources. In fact, he outlined a large part of this in his PhD thesis he made 3 years prior to becoming president. He fired Chernomyrdin from his chair position and used the state's voting power to remove the CEO, Vyakirev.
Это на 100% совпадает с политикой Путина. Более того, это говорит о том, что политика Путина из слов превращается в дела. Мало есть таких фигур в России, смена которых настолько важна, настолько значима, как смена «Газпрома».
He replaced them with Dmitry Medvedev and Alexei Miller, his former employees from St. Petersburg.
Миллер – это выходец из Петербурга, он известен как человек свой для новой генерации российских политиков, которые сейчас руководит государством. Миллер, как руководитель «Газпрома», он сохранит прямой канал выхода на президента.
Over the next decade, Gazprom seized back assets and shares that were notoriously sold by Chernomyrdin and Vyakirev for ridiculously low prices, most notably selling assets in the form of gas fields and joint ventures worth $11 billion for just under $600 million. This was all made to a single privately owned company, Itera LLC, headquartered in the Netherlands and owned by Igor Makarov, close associate of Vyakirev, former Gazprom CEO. Gazprom also started acquiring many companies not directly under state control, from both foreign and domestic investors, such as Sakhalin Energy from Shell or Sibneft, now renamed Gazpromneft, from well-known oligarch Abramovich. This was all in the name of resource security and ensuring that the largest and most critical companies are in the hands of the Russian state, not in private hands, such as Itera, which was the 4th largest gas-producing company in the world, and Sibneft, which was the 3rd largest oil producer in Russia. Currently, Gazprom is owned by the state through the Federal Agency for State Property Management, Rosneft Gas, a fully state-owned holding company, and Rosgazifikatsiya, which is a subsidiary of Rosneft Gas, therefore giving the state majority control. Gazprom itself has subsidiaries in nearly every economic sector of Russia, ranging from banking, insurance, airlines, and even satellite communications. It has used its Kremlin influence to exert power domestically. For example, in the year 2000, when it forced the only independent television channel in Russia at the time to be acquired by Gazprom through its Gazprom media subsidiary. This came after it criticized and opposed the Kremlin on multiple matters, from the Kursk submarine disaster, supporting opposing political factions, and ultimately launching an independent investigation surrounding FSB involvement into the Russian apartment bombings, which were a vehicle for the Second Chechen War and granted Putin popularity as president.
Трудно назвать этих людей людьми, их даже зверями назвать нельзя.
That was the final nail on the coffin and led to its seizure.
And now we understand in which way Mr. Putin is going to take care of NTV journalists.
Gazprom has also had a massive influence in global politics. It has been used multiple times as a geopolitical weapon by Putin to any possible adversary, mainly European states, due to their over-reliance on Russian gas through means of overpriced gas and hostage gas as a resource. Don't do as I say and your gas will be cut off. Of course, for a normal business this isn't in your best interest and can mean lost revenue. All this is allowed due to the direct control granted to Putin and the Kremlin through the state's share majority and close associates being at the helm of Gazprom. Lukoil is the second largest company in Russia and the largest private one in the country. However, this wasn't always the case. It was first established as a state-owned enterprise in 1991, merging numerous state-owned oil enterprises located in western Siberia, Langapas, Uray and Kogalin, where the name comes from, as well as refineries in Perm, Volgograd and Novosibirsk. This was all supervised by the then Soviet Deputy Minister of Oil Production, Vagit Alekperov, who then became its CEO after it was privatized by presidential decree in 1993. A year later, Lukoil started selling some of its shares to the general public in Russia and to foreign investors as well. Currently, over 30% of its shares are owned by Alekperov, making him one of the richest oligarchs in Russia, worth nearly $30 billion. Over 9% is owned by Leonid Fedun, another Russian oligarch and former vice president of Lukoil and close friend of Alekperov. And over 5% is owned by a private company, Superman Holdings Limited, located in Cyprus, most likely a shell company for Alekperov or his close associates. The rest is owned by individual and institutional investors. The latest available information states that Lukoil has supposedly paid 191 billion rubles in taxes in 2021, meaning that Lukoil itself is responsible for just under 0.7% of all tax collected that year. Again, this is a single private company of which over 40% is owned by two people. Now, this isn't to say that Lukoil is completely invulnerable from government scrutiny. In fact, it's very much the opposite. In 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, the Lukoil board of directors, headed by Ravil Maganov, issued a statement describing the conflict as a tragedy and called for a quick end to the war. Just a few months later, he was hospitalized at the Central Clinical Hospital in Moscow after suffering a heart attack. He was later found dead after falling out from his window, and it was ruled as suicide. That very same day, Putin was visiting that hospital to pay respects to Gorbachev, who died earlier that week. Whether this is murder or suicide is disputed, but this came after and before many other deaths of high-ranking Russian officials who died from mysterious circumstances after criticizing the Kremlin's decision regarding the Ukraine war. Lukoil is heavily influential outside of Russia. It owns refineries in Romania, Bulgaria, and a joint venture in the Netherlands. Its gas station business is also extensive, operating in 17 countries outside of Russia, most notably throughout the Balkans and the United States, where it franchises just under 200 gas stations. But that can be ruled as honest business. But what isn't honest business is the alleged funding of a presidential campaign in Czechia, securing Miloš Zeman's presidency in 2013. Zeman's political party received multiple donations from Kremlin-affiliated individuals, funded by Lukoil, Miroslav Sluf and Martin Nejedly. Zeman denied their connections with the Kremlin and Lukoil, but his politics and outlooks didn't. He adopted a pro-Russian stance, criticized Western sanctions on Russia, denied claims of Russian troops being present in Crimea back in 2014, and was supposed to attend the Russian Victory Day parade in 2015. But after much protest from his voters, he decided on a Russian state visit instead. He remained as the president of Czechia for a decade, his term only ending in 2023. More recently, the Financial Times have reported that Lukoil has circumvented sanctions imposed onto them at the dawn of the Ukraine war by operating a shadow fleet of oil tankers that ship Russian oil around the globe. This fleet is estimated to consist of over 400 different vessels. These tankers are purchased by offshore entities exclusively funded by Lukoil and has been a common practice by many other Russian companies. And prior to the war, Russia relied on many Western tankers to export its oil. Now it has become a lot more independent, self-reliant, and profitable. Rosneft was formed from the privatization of the USSR Ministry of Oil Industry in 1991. The current CEO and chairman being Igor Sechin, former Soviet army interpreter with supposed links to the KGB. He was also Putin's chief of staff when he was mayor in St. Petersburg, and is often regarded as the possible successor of Putin. Currently, it is the third largest company in Russia and the second largest state-owned company. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, throughout the 90s, it struggled heavily to compete with oligarch-owned giants like Yukos, Lukoil, Sibneft, who had a lot more support and capital to run their operations. Rosneft's original purpose was to ensure stable production of oil and other natural resources for state needs. In fact, it controlled over 60% of oil production in Russia, but due to the dire financial situation at the time, it made it hard for a state enterprise to function effectively, especially due to the outdated and rundown assets and equipment that Rosneft owned. This led to many of its assets being sold off to big companies, and it was supposed to be privatized on many occasions, each time failing due to disagreements of its value, inner conflicts, or the state blocking its sale to large privatized companies. The Russian government really wanted to prevent private companies from gaining majority control of state assets again. After all, Rosneft controlled a substantial amount of assets. It just didn't have the capital available to exploit them efficiently. However, towards the end of the 90s, it appointed new management, headed by Sergei Bogdanchikov, a former director of a Sakhalin-based oil company. When Putin was appointed president, he really pushed the agenda of having a mighty state-owned oil enterprise that could curb the power and influence of private and oligarch-owned businesses, similar to Gazprom. And Bogdanchikov was the perfect candidate. Bogdanchikov wasn't a big name in any government or oligarchy circles. His career took off towards the end of the Yeltsin era, just like Putin. Without much ties to the previous era of the Russian elite, they had little influence over him. There couldn't have been anyone better. With Putin as president, Russia recovering from its financial crisis, Bogdanchikov at the head of Rosneft, and a little financial help from the state through Gazprom, Rosneft started repaying its debt, consolidated its assets, and acquired productive facilities such as a 26% stake in Verkhnechansk oil field, one of the giant oil fields in Siberia. It was quickly becoming the leading oil company in Russia. This was all possible due to the special privileges it was granted by being a state-owned enterprise fully supported by the president and the Kremlin, and many private companies were critical of this special privilege, most notably Yukos. Yukos was the largest private Russian oil company at the time, owned by oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky. In a meeting between Putin and the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, mainly made up of oligarchs and owners of Russia's industry, Khodorkovsky complained about the special treatment Rosneft received, reduced prices for oil and gas, priority to licenses and contracts, as well as low interest loans from state banks. In other words, corruption. This wasn't received well by Putin or Kremlin, and a few months later, Khodorkovsky was arrested under suspicion of tax fraud through supposedly owing $27 billion in unpaid taxes.
Если они хотят, чтобы я сел в тюрьму при сегодняшней системе поведения, которая сейчас нам демонстрируется, это легко, пожалуйста.
Putin just arrested the richest man in Russia, the largest and most powerful oligarch at the time. All Yukos assets were frozen and then sold for knockdown prices to Rosneft in a closed-room auction. The biggest being Untitled, which accounted for 60% of Yukos's oil production and was sold to Rosneft for a measly $10 billion. It was valued at $56 billion a year later by Rosneft. And that practically cemented Rosneft as the largest and most powerful oil company in Russia. But more importantly, it showed Putin's grip over Russia's resources and its oligarchs. Defy Putin and you will lose everything. Rosneft's assets are valued at $223 billion, with a yearly gross revenue of $93.6 billion. Its current shareholders being Rosneftegas, two of its subsidiaries Neft Capital Invest and RN Capital LLC, giving the state majority ownership, the minority being owned by a Qatari oil investment firm and British giant BP. However, BP did announce that it would exit this investment in 2022 due to the war in Ukraine, but it holds this stake as a shadow shareholder to this day. When the war ends in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia with it, BP will be able to reaffirm its stake in Rosneft and potentially receive its backlog dividends worth billions. But that's not guaranteed. Surgutneftegas was formed from the privatization of several West Siberian oil and gas reserves back in 1994, to this day having the same CEO and alleged owner Vladimir Bogdanov, who has been the director of the Surgut oil fields since 1983. It is the fourth largest oil and gas company in Russia. However, the current structure and ownership of Surgutneftegas is not known, as they do not disclose their shareholders. It has even been rumored to be partially owned by Putin, but there is little evidence of that being the case. The most in-depth investigation into its ownership was made by Russian newspaper Vedomosti in 2007. It concluded that around 72% of the company was owned by its management through two rings of companies and non-profits located in Russia and Cyprus, each of these companies owning each other, creating a purposefully confusing web of ownership. However, some of these companies are owned by the current Surgutneftegas employees. This may suggest that the company is not under the direct shareholder control of the state and is a private enterprise owned by Bogdanov, the CEO, and his associates. But this is where it gets interesting. Back in 2008, in the annual shareholder meeting of Surgutneftegas, concern was expressed regarding the small dividends paid out to its minority shareholders and its lack of transparency in ownership. The minority shareholder expressing these concerns was none other than Alexei Navalny. He also stated that a significant amount of Surgutneftegas exports are carried out through an intermediary, Gunvor Group, a Swiss commodity trading company owned by Gennady Timchenko, one of Russia's richest oligarchs and close friend of Putin. In fact, Gunvor received multiple contracts for transportation and trading of Surgut's oil and was responsible for around 30% of Russia's oil exports from giants like Rosneft and Gazprom Neft. Now, I would like to go into a lot more detail about Gunvor, but I believe that it deserves a video for itself. So if that's something you'd like to see, then comment down below and subscribe. Now, back to the board meeting. Bogdanov's reply to Navalny's comments on Surgut's ownership and dealings with Gunvor were vague and gave little clarification. A few years later, Surgutneftegas bought a 21% stake in Hungarian oil giant MOL from Austrian OMV. This was rejected by the Hungarian government and MOL itself, but the sale was already confirmed. MOL itself rejected to register Surgutneftegas as a shareholder with rights, stating its lack of transparent leadership, and Surgutneftegas was forced to sell its stake to the Hungarian state for 1.8 billion, 440 million more than it acquired it from Austrian OVM. This utter lack of transparency within the Surgut oil company has shrouded it in mystery and speculation regarding its purpose and who it accounts for. After all, it is the fourth largest oil company in Russia with assets worth 58 billion and revenue of 26 billion in 2023 alone. It also holds most of its assets in cash, the most out of any oil or gas company in the world, mainly in dollars and euros, making it very resilient to inflation of the ruble and extremely liquid. Now, in my opinion, because there is nothing else I can give, it being such a large company, especially in Russia, where most large enterprises are owned or controlled heavily by the state, it is most likely used by many government or top officials and oligarchs as a source of capital, potentially circumventing sanctions through its Cypriot companies. Of course, this is all my own speculation, and the truth could be very different. Whatever the real purpose of Surgutneftegas is, it's paramount that it stays a secret. In fact, towards the end of 2024, Putin himself signed a decree allowing Surgutneftegas to further limit its public disclosures of business as a privately owned company. Transneft is the only company on this list which doesn't directly deal with the production of fossil fuels. It transports them. Transneft is the largest oil pipeline company in the world, and it transports 80% of Russian oil through its extensive 70,000 kilometer pipeline network, connecting Russia with Europe through its Soviet-built Druzhba oil pipeline and Asia with the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline. It also owns most of the pipelines within Russia itself, connecting drilling operations with refineries and transport hubs. An important thing to note here, it does not own the pipelines going through Turkey or the Nord Stream pipelines through the Baltics. Those are all governed by Gazprom. As all these other companies on the list, Transneft was the result of privatization in 1993 and succeeded the main Directorate for Oil Transportation and Supply of the USSR Ministry of Oil Industry. It then followed with a merger of Transneft Produkt, another pipeline company, in 2007 under the presidential decree of Putin. Its current president being Nikolai Tokarev, former KGB agent stationed in Germany where he met Putin, and the chairman being Alexander Novak, the current deputy chairman of the Russian government, right under its prime minister. 100% of its ordinary shares are owned by the Russian state through the Federal Agency for State Property Management, amounting to a total of 79% of total capital. The other 21% is in preferred shares in free circulation on the market. But again, majority of those are still owned by the state through Gazprom Bank. This gives the Russian state a near complete monopoly on oil transportation within the country as well as outside, given that the state controls most export pipelines as well. This gives Transneft the ability to set their own tariffs and fees for using their pipelines that companies have no chance but to pay, as there is no alternative. But how has Russia held onto this monopoly for over 30 years, especially with such big privatized companies like Lukoil and now the defunct Yukos? Well, simply put, it's the law. The federal law on natural monopolies adopted by the State Duma in 1995 outlines that state enterprises such as Transneft are natural monopolies and are all regulated by the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service. It doesn't specifically outlaw privatization or construction of private pipelines, but it makes it very difficult to do so. In fact, in 2003, multiple private companies suggested building a new pipeline system and terminal for the northern port of Murmansk, allowing to export more oil to the west, specifically the US, in theory creating a private pipeline system that would not be controlled or tariffed by the state. This project received much criticism from Transneft and was later abandoned. The port of Murmansk is now an LNG hub with the gas pipelines leading to it, owned by the state through Gazprom. During the same time, Yukos proposed a pipeline connecting to China, allowing for exports into the Asian market. Again, this faced many challenges, and then after the dismantling of Yukos, it was scrapped in favor of constructing the ESPO, connecting Russia with China and Japan, the project being overseen and owned by Transneft. Funnily enough, the same exact project was then accused of corruption. This came after a formal review was submitted by the Russian audit chamber, asking for justification for the costs of constructing the ESPO, citing things such as uncompetitive contract tenders and the overall viability of chosen contractors. But nothing was done about it, and the document was classified. A formal criminal investigation was launched only after the document was leaked and Navalny's complaints were voiced. But to this day, not a single person was ever charged or arrested. The Russian state has used Transneft to control its domestic oil consortiums through preferred tariffs set by themselves, disallowing the construction of independent pipelines and strong-arming companies for their own benefit. But it hasn't employed these tactics just domestically. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium, the CPC, is a pipeline system running from the vast Kazakh oil fields of Tengiz, Karachagnak and Kashagan around the Caspian Sea into Russia, connecting it with the Russian port of Novorossiysk. In 2023, exporting over 56 million tons of Kazakhstan's oil, or around a third of its total exports. However, the majority of these oil fields are not even owned by Russia. These were all bought out by Western enterprises in the early 90s, when Russia had its hands full with its own problems. The biggest of the fields, Tengiz, is operated by Tengizchevroil, a joint venture between American Chevron, ExxonMobil, Kazakh state-owned Kazmunaygas, and only 5% being owned by Lukoil. This one field accounts for 1% of total global oil production. The other oil fields are under ownership of other Western and Eastern firms such as Shell, BP, Eni, and the CNPC. All of the oil fields are operated wholly or in majority by Western companies. But Kazakhstan geography becomes a problem. It cannot ship a substantial amount of oil through its Caspian seaport in Aktau due to infrastructural constraints, as well as the Caspian Sea being shallow, allowing only smaller tankers to transport oil. Building a pipeline through the Caspian Sea connecting it with a pre-existing Baku pipeline would be extremely expensive compared to an onshore pipeline. And building an onshore pipeline through the south that would flow through Turkmenistan and Iran and potentially Iraq was not a good option, for obvious reasons. The best cost-effective option was the north, through Russia, terminating at the marine terminal of Novorossiysk. Thus, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium was born. Initially, 50% of the shares of the CPC were owned by the private companies that owned the oil fields. Chevron with the largest slice of 15%, Lukoil, Exxon, Shell, and Eni. The other half was owned by the state of Kazakhstan, Oman, and the largest share going to the Russian Federation, 24%. The construction was estimated at around $2.6 billion, all paid by the Western companies, Russia donating around $300 million worth of unused pipeline assets. Put simply, Russia was able to obtain a 24% stake in the CPC for a measly $300 million. But come the 2000s and everything changed. With Putin in charge and his vision for the country being clear, it was seen as unacceptable for such a consortium to exist on Russian soil that is not directly controlled by the state. In 2008, it bought Oman's stake in the CPC, increasing its share to 31%, not being able to obtain a controlling stake in the business. But this wasn't the end of the world for Putin. After all, the pipeline is on Russian land. Over the coming years, Russia's grip on the CPC tightened through forceful implementation of a Russian board of directors, which in turn awarded overpriced contracts to specific Russian companies, which were all paid by the CPC's Western owners after straight up blocking Western representatives from reviewing contracts and bids. All this was allowed by Chevron and others because so much more money was to be made. These payments were basically bribery. Even recently, Chevron announced its $48 billion expansion in its Tengiz oil fields, and all their oil will be flowing through the CPC. What Russia has not been able to control through direct ownership, it controls through Transneft. Multiple times it has increased domestic transit and export tariffs, and companies have no other choice than to accept. It has also used Transneft as a political weapon. For example, in 2008, when the Czech Republic agreed to host a US radar station linked to the country's missile defense system, shortly after, the Druzhba oil pipeline owned by Transneft reduced its output by half. Moscow stated that this cut in supply was due to technical reasons and that it had no political motivation. More recently, in 2022, after the West imposed sanctions on Russia and many of its oligarchs, leading to eye-watering seizures of capital, the CPC experienced multiple disruptions and shutdowns, crippling oil supply into Europe, causing price hikes, most notably in March that year, where the global market reacted by a $5 per barrel increase. To this day, the CPC itself has not been sanctioned, enabling Russia to profit billions from the transportation of this oil year on year. Novatek is the second largest gas producer after Gazprom and the seventh largest in the world. Just like the others, formed through privatization of a state enterprise in 1994, responsible for developing gas fields in the Yamal-Nenets Autonomous District, one of the richest natural gas regions in the world. The current CEO being Leonid Mikhelson, one of the richest men in Russia worth $30 billion. He was the director of Novatek's state-owned precursor and has been an instrumental part of Novatek throughout the decades. Novatek is privately owned by Mikhelson, Volga Group, an investment vehicle of oligarch Gennady Timchenko, Total Energies, and Gazprom. An interesting shareholder here is French Total Energies, who has consistently increased its stake since it bought out 12% of Novatek in 2009, assisting in developing numerous LNG plants. But since 2022, this stake has been written off as a loss, but has not been sold. On paper, Novatek is a private company. It is not held in majority by the state or a state enterprise. However, Mikhelson's and Timchenko's ties to Putin and effectively the Russian state cannot be undermined. Both are seen as confidants of Putin and within his inner circles, specifically Timchenko, who has had a very long-lasting friendship with Putin, dating back to at least the early 90s, Putin originally granting Timchenko an oil export license in 1991. This leads many to believe that although Novatek isn't under direct state control, it is very much in Putin's sphere of influence. In recent years, Novatek has also been instrumental in the development of LNG plants and technology in Russia, acquiring multiple ventures for such exploitation, most notably the Yamal LNG plant in Sabeta and the not yet completed Arctic LNG 1 and 2 plants in the Gida Peninsula. But with the war in Ukraine came sanctions. These covered equipment and resources sent to Russia that were needed for the construction of the Arctic LNG projects, forcing Russia to buy these elsewhere and delaying the project further. However, what wasn't included in the sanctions list was the importing of Russian LNG into Europe by Novatek. Over recent years, Europe and the EU has dedicated a lot of its budget on the development of LNG terminals, part of the reason being to reduce the reliance on Russian pipeline gas, allowing Europe to ship gas from other countries in the form of LNG. Although more LNG has been shipped from countries like the US, Norway, and Qatar, a considerable amount is still shipped from Russia.
The EU has been trying to reduce its dependence on Russian energy imports. Despite this, the bloc is still the biggest importer of Russian liquefied natural gas.
In fact, since 2022, Russia has shipped more LNG year on year into Europe, primarily France, Belgium, and Spain. In 2024, reaching record quantities of nearly 18 million tons, around 50% of total Russian LNG exports. The largest share of this being imported into France, 6.3 million tons. Over 2/3 of that by Total Energies, a minority shareholder of Novatek and its LNG projects. With Russian laws being implemented leading to further liberalization of Russian LNG exports and increased state funding into such projects, it is no surprise that Novatek has been able to expand at such a rapid rate. On top of this, with Gazprom being completely crippled by sanctions, including the Sakhalin 2 LNG plant, the only direct Novatek competitor, it has enabled Novatek and its benefactors to dodge sanctions imposed by Europe, raking raking in increasing billions through its expanding LNG business. In fact, it has now become the major gas supplier into Europe, dethroning long-standing Gazprom. The only question regarding Novatek is its ownership and alignment with Russia and Putin. Although it is in private hands, it can be easily argued that it is under heavy Kremlin influence. Much of its business opportunities granted by Timchenko's and Mikkelson's close ties with Putin. Any dissidence in Novatek's leadership could lead to a repeat of what happened to Yukos in the early 2000s. Sibur is the largest petrochemical company in Russia. It does not directly produce oil or gas. It purchases waste products from Gazprom, Lukoil, Rosneft and whoever else to produce synthetic products such as plastic and rubber and sell them worldwide. Its biggest factories are located in western Siberia, the largest oil producing region in Russia. In 2023, its revenue amounted to over 1 trillion rubles and its total assets to 2 trillion rubles. It was originally formed under government decree in 1995, consolidating multiple gas and petrochemical plants in Siberia and privatized in 1998 under ownership of Gazprom and the new CEO Yakov Goldovsky. Goldovsky was very ambitious. Throughout the early 90s, he opened multiple businesses involving trading consumer goods, importing and production, before finally transitioning his business into oil. He created the Gas, Oil and Chemical Company, GNK, and started working alongside giants like Rosneft and Lukoil. When Sibur was privatized, he became co-owner of the company and started its transformation into a fully vertically integrated company. With the help of associates he met earlier in Gazprom, Goldovsky went on a spending spree, taking out loans from multiple Russian banks, in turn acquiring over 60 companies throughout Russia, and by 2001 spending over $500 million in the process, drowning Sibur, and effectively Gazprom, in debt. He wanted to negate this debt by converting it into company shares that could be bought by any willing investor. However, this would completely dilute Gazprom's stock, meaning it would lose its controlling stake in the company and effectively give more control of Sibur to Goldovsky and his oil company. But as you know by now, this was the turn of the millennia and Putin came into power, and with him, everything changed. The previous Gazprom leadership, which was well acquainted with Goldovsky, was replaced with Putin favorites, and Goldovsky and his associates were arrested on charges of abuse of power and embezzlement. He was forced to sell his stake in Sibur to Gazprom for $95 million, a lot less than it was worth. After numerous attempts at selling or redistributing Sibur assets, it was finally sold out to private hands in 2008. Those being the owners of the aforementioned Novatek, Mikkelson with 31%, Timchenko with 14.5%, Sogaz with 10%, and the Chinese Silk Road Fund and Sinopec with 8.5% each. 15% is also owned by former TAIF group directors. TAIF, or the Tatar American Investment and Finance Company, was listed as one of the largest private companies in Russia in 2019, effectively owned by the Tatarstan oligarchy. It was created by the Tatar ASSR in 1990 as a foreign trade association and was responsible for the privatization of Tatarstan's largest enterprises, ranging from oil refineries, gas stations, real estate, and TV channels. It effectively owned everything in Tatarstan, but it also specialized in the production of petrochemicals, effectively making it Sibur's only direct competitor. But in 2021, most of its business was bought out and absorbed by Sibur, and its previous owners received a 15% stake in Sibur as part of the deal. The last 12.3% is owned by senior Sibur executives, most notably Kirill Shalamov, with a 3.8% stake, which he acquired a few months after marrying Putin's daughter, supposedly purchasing it for $100 through an offshore company. A year later, buying an additional 70% of Sibur from Timchenko after taking a loan from Gazprom Bank, where his brother is a senior executive, but he sold the stake for an undisclosed price in 2017 to Leonid Mikkelson, a few months after he divorced Putin's daughter. He owns his initial stake to this day. Since the mid-2000s, Sibur has expanded its business domestically and internationally. It has developed many new plants producing materials and chemicals that were previously dependent on being imported, many of these being chemicals used in the production of military equipment like rocket fuels and fiberglass. Sibur exports many of these products directly into Europe through its Austrian-based subsidiary, Sibur International. According to an article by The Insider, in 2022, those exports amounted to over $3 billion. In the summer of 2024, Sibur International's accounts were frozen by the Austrian Ministry of the Interior on the belief that its owners were under sanctions by the EU. This was taken to court and then overruled, due to the fact that the majority of ownership, over 50%, was not on the EU sanction list and the accounts were reinstated. That's the richest man in Russia, close ally and friend of Putin, who has benefited significantly from the war in Ukraine, is not on the EU sanctions list. Sibur is able to trade into Europe through that subsidiary to this day. The last 40 years of Russian history have been filled with chaos. That chaos led to what we have in front of us today. On one hand, throughout all of this, Russia has retained its own resource independence, something many countries lack. There are always massive debates when it comes to nationalized enterprises being privatized and how bad that can be. You could say that Putin's attempts to control his country's resources have actually been of great value to Russia, rather than selling everything to international companies. But how that value is being used by Russia and its oligarchs, well, not so much. With the recent reports about Putin spending countless days in bunkers amid fears of assassination attempts, his grip on Russia is slipping, and with it, the entire system he spent decades building may collapse. When I was originally researching for this video, it was back in mid-2025, so some things may have definitely changed, so please keep that in mind. Any corrections will be in the description, and if there's anything you believe I got wrong, then please comment down below, or just tell me what you like or didn't like about the video. Anyway, thank you for watching, and if you feel like this video was worth something, then subscribe.